Hello, hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to another episode of Teach Gen Tech. Today we have Dan joining us, and I'm excited about today. We met at Denver Startup Week, which was, oh goodness, about a month ago now. And y'all, I just want to let you know, for especially those going into DevRel, is you can be not technical and awkwardly just walk up to people and ask questions. That's what I did. And this is how Dan is on the show. So, Dan, please introduce yourself and what you're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, Jen, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the chance to chat with you today. And I think that is good advice for DevRel, right? You want to be curious and be interested in helping people. I am head of DevRel at a company called Auth. We're a Denver company, and what we do is we help developers add authentication into their applications. It's undifferentiated functionality that is a little bit risky and critical to your users, but I always say, no one ever said, oh my God, what a great logging experience. People just want to get to the features that your application has. And so today I'm going to be talking about authentication in general. Don't worry, it won't be a Fusion Auth ad. We're going to talk about authentication in a historical sense and some other things too. So, yeah.
Yay! And good morning, homie. Thank you for joining. And yeah, y'all. So I also just want to say, I ended up going to a CTO luncheon during Denver Startup Week. I was like, I don't know if they're going to let me in, but I need food. And so I went. And they did. And Fusion Office was there. So I ended up talking about to a few other members of the team. And I was like, I don't even understand what this is. I will say you guys have nice shirts. It's very soft, so they're swag, and they have, good, coffee cups. So I will say that, but I didn't know that when I walked up to all of them. Uh,
Actually, real quick, I'm happy to give away a T-shirt to a randomly selected stream viewer if they'd be interested. If you'd be okay with that. Okay, cool, great, yeah.
wait. One stipulation: they need to share the video from YouTube.
And I guess the second stipulation is they need to be in the US or Canada. Shipping out
Okay.
to their place in
Yeah.
the world is tough. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone.
Yeah. So y'all share the YouTube video and tag us. So it can be me, Fusion Auth, and Dan, or at least tag me so I know that you're sharing it. I can tag everybody else. And yeah, exactly, homie. I'm like, authentication is not fun. But I'm like, why? Like, why do we okay. And y'all, please ignore my dog in the background. She doesn't know if she's coming or going, and she's driving me bonkers today. She's a regular in the show. Doggo, ma'am, please stop. We'll see if she decides to calm down. Okay, she's not gonna calm down. BRB. Doggo.
This is how you all know it's really live. It's really live.
Especially when my partner works from home, she's like, I don't know whose office I want to be in, but you guys shut your doors. So I want to be where the door is shut.
Always,
Boy, are
always.
they. But I'm actually really excited about this because I learned a lot from your presentation of like the history of authentication. And I do want to get into that. But when I don't necessarily understand what is authentication, please explain.
Sure, sure. So I think the easiest way to think about authentication is when we were all hunter-gatherers, everyone knew everybody else, right? And I could immediately know if someone was like a member of my tribe or a stranger because I recognized their faces and I kind of had grown up with them. When we started to organize into societies and people started traveling more, there needed to be some way to trust people that
Mhm.
was that you didn't know personally or you didn't know through a friend or a friend or anything like that. Obviously, with the internet, we have that even at a wider scale. So authentication at its root is a way for someone to prove their identity to someone who doesn't know them in the sense of a hunter gatherer. And there's obviously a lot of ways to do it, but at its root, it is a way to know someone is who they say they are, basically.
Okay. And that totally makes sense. When I think of authentication, I think about like SSO, which we're going to knowledge check myself of. SSO is single sign on.
Correct.
Yes. And if I understand, like the example I like to use is when I worked for a corporate company, you would sign into the computer, and therefore the computer would sign you into all of your other applications, email, all of it. You didn't have to log in every single time.
Yep.
Um, and then there's like Facebook and Google and GitHub that you can use those accounts to log into other products.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have things like VPNs and like the tokens you got to use and two factor, and then I get lost.
Sure.
And especially with like all the passwords people need, and then the especially in like the API world or cloud world, like there's also a ton of authentication that I'm just
Mm-hmm.
like, what if we're just going and like, if we were to know about authentication and you're talking to us like we know what we're talking about, what types of authentication are being used right now?
Sure, sure. So, kind of an easy way to think about it is, well, there's a couple ways to think about it, right? The first is, what steps do I take to prove I am who I say I am? And people in authentication, like people in technology all over the place, love jargon. And so the technical term for that is a factor of authentication. So when you hear MFA, that just means you use more than one way to prove yourself. So the three big categories of that are what something you know, something you have, or something you are. So an example of something you know is a username and password. Something you have might be you can prove that you have access to a phone if it gets an SMS message that has a particular code. And so you're proving you have access to the phone, which presumably, or at least to the SMS, the account receiving the SMS. It could not necessarily be a phone, but um, and then something you are is example that is like a fingerprint or facial recognition. So
Okay.
those factors are kind of the foundational level, and then things are built on top of it. Like single sign-on is built on top of that, and that's basically kind of a trust relationship between two or more parties. So your computer had a trust relationship with all those applications that once you logged into your computer, all those applications said, "Oh yeah, we know, right? We know that Jen has logged in." Or as you said, um, a lot of applications have a trust relationship with Google, so they say, "Hey, go log in Google, and if Google comes back and says you're Jen Janode at foo.com, we trust that, and we're gonna treat you as an authenticated user." So um, those are kind of there's multiple layers of the authentication cake, which is as Homie said, right? It's not fun, but I found after a couple of years of it's interesting because you start off and you say, "Oh, it's just a username and password," right? That's pretty easy, but you start to peel this back, and the question of how you prove someone, how you trust someone is who they say they are at scale in a way that is secure but isn't super painful for the user, and is cost effective for the company is turns out to be a really interesting problem.
And that's something that I'm definitely like, I'm getting way ahead of myself wanting to know about this, but like how works into like APIs and all of that, because
Sure.
I'm like, I can't picture it, but now I want to see it like happen. And a lot of that is like skipping way ahead. That's totally where my mind goes like half the time. But
Yeah.
and luckily in like having teach Gen Tech, I have people like you that will just come on and talk about a random topic, and I'm like, cool, we can noodle on that for a while and eventually get there, because I'm learning Python from like the very very beginning and like the details of it, and then everything else I've been like, let's just figure it out as we go, we'll just have a
Sure.
one-off call about it.
Sure.
And I think that's been so fun, so that's why I'm like, I need to take a step back, I cannot do that, I need to understand security. And then homie just said, agreed. Dan, I'm not sure if it will be such a monster with more understanding. Teach us, sensei.
Awesome. Thank you, homie. That's awesome.
So can you go through more of like how we went through like the tribal recognition or like small group recognition? Not sure how that would be said properly to MFA.
Yeah, so talking about some more of the history.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I did this presentation, and it was not a PhD thesis, so please don't, quote me if I get some dates wrong, but it looked like the first form of authentication that I was able to find were some clay seals that happened in the Sumerian region in about 3500 BCE, and those were basically clay seals that were rolled onto clay tablets and had a certain pattern. And then you could, when the clay tablet dried, you knew that whatever's on that clay tablet, a contract or like a list of grain or whatever, was attested to by whoever held that seal. So that's an example of
Ooh,
authentication by holding something, right? That possession of that seal authenticated the user, and typically that seal was handed out by the ruler. So it was,
interesting.
yeah.
It
Um,
makes me think of like, and I didn't even think of this during the presentation that you gave, but like, how it's like your ID is another form of an authentication, and that's kind
100%.
of, and then Rivet just said, anyone has seen a horror movie, they know they shouldn't mess with any
For sure, for sure.
Sumerian seals you find.
Not always
Yes.
used, not always used for boring contracts, right? Sometimes used for more exciting things.
And I feel like even like Jumanji, like you had to like win your way out of it and authenticate yourself and
Right.
prove that. Interesting. That is a great like wraparound. I like that, Rivet. All right. So we're to the point where there's different types of authentic in like a seal or a um is it up was like words were words before that or after that? But I meant out of context, y'all. Dan through his presentation was talking about how different people from different areas would use like a secret word or
Mm.
a like
Watchword you're talking about, or oh no,
yeah,
the shibboleth is what you're
yeah,
talking about.
that one.
Yeah. So it's a funny story. So basically, or well, kind of funny now, but basically the idea was that you can authenticate someone based on who they are. And in this particular case, it was the way they pronounced a word. And so there were two tribes fighting in ancient Israel, and this is recorded in the Bible. And they were having a war, and there was a river. One side was one tribe's property, and the other was the other tribe's property. And so someone invaded him. I think it was the Gileadites and the Ephraimites, and the one side was trying to get back across the river to their side, and the Ephraimites, I think, discovered that the Gileadites said a word differently than the Ephraimites did, and that word was shibboleth. They actually pronounced it sibboleth, and so they were authenticating every soldier who was trying to cross the river and saying, "Hey, say this word," and if they didn't say the word correctly, they killed them. And so that was an example of authentication with very high stakes, and it was like an inherent quality of the particular tribe people, right, or the particular the way that they pronounce those words. So authentication doesn't just, and both these cases, by the way, are kind of group authentication, right? Like you held the seal as a because you've been handed it to you by the ruler, or you pronounce the word a certain way. We think of authentication as like a way to identify a single person because it's very common today, but it can be a way to authenticate a group as well.
And that's and because I'm always like, but what's next? How did they move to authenticating computers from words? How
Yeah.
did
So,
we get there?
so yeah. So, the early computer systems, basically when you had access to ENIAC and those other computer systems in the 40s and 50s, the access was the authentication, right? There was no kind of second layer check. If you could put the cards into the card reader, the punch cards, then you were obviously authenticated to be there. So it's worth saying that still authentication happened. It just didn't happen at the computer level, right? There was a security guard probably outside the building, and if you got, they probably checked your ID at that point, right? To your point about
Mhm.
IDs. But in the 60s, they started to build these computer systems that had remote access or more than one account, and people were starting to be limited, right? Like some students had a couple hours a week, or the professors had more, and people ended up starting to have usernames and passwords. And 1961, I think it was the MIMS system. I'd have to pull up the presentation, but that was the first known instance of a password, and it was in 61. It was the
We're gonna
CTSS. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're going through this presentation kind of quickly just so that way y'all know on a high level thing because it could take the entire time, but yeah, it's definitely been a very very fun thing that you said that the stu if I remember correctly, the students like somebody hacked into like figured out the password so everyone could have more time to use it.
Yeah, so 61 is when the password was invented, and then 62 is when the first password hack happened. So actually, the one of the students, again, he was a PhD student. He was limited to 4 hours a week, and so what he did was he found out there was a way to print out the password file, and because the password file wasn't accessible, because they were protecting it to some extent, but so he couldn't look at it online, but he was able to actually print it out, and then he shared it around because he wanted to let other people have access to the system. And the funny story is that 25 years later, he apologized to his PhD advisor and said, "Hey, I'm sorry, I was the one who did that," and they didn't take his PhD away from him. So thankfully, um, he was able to do that. But yeah, so it didn't take very long from 61 when they invented the password to 62 when when there was the first kind of password hack that happened.
And Rivet said that they're impressed that it even took a year, and yeah, I mean it was brand new back then, so maybe they were just like, what is it? Who knows? Who knows? And that like definitely brings us more towards like how did it change? How did authentication change when the internet launched?
Yeah, so the internet kind of opened up this whole. I mean, obviously in the 80s, the 70s and 80s and 90s with the PC, there were local area networks and things like that. But I think the big thing the internet brought is it brought so many systems online, and I think that sorry, online. That's the wrong way to put it. It brought so many systems to be more accessible to everybody.
Hmm.
And a LAN, if I steal someone's password in a local area network, I can do some damage, but I have to have proximate physical access to that
Hmm.
LAN, right? I need to be able to go into the office, even if you're a multinational company with LANs and WANs, which are kind of across all your offices. You still need some kind of access to get there.
Hmm.
But the internet changed the game because now if I steal someone's password and I'm in Australia or Russia or China or wherever, I can still get access to their systems and their credentials if that system is on the internet. So that brought in the real need for more security, right? So that's bringing in more multi-factor options. And obviously, I'm talking about kind of from the consumer perspective. The military and business worlds were ahead of the consumer perspective
Hmm.
in terms of securing accounts. But
Hmm.
the difference between someone being able to like steal your corporate password and steal your banking password, if your banking software is online, that gets to be pretty small in terms of overall impact to the individual, right? Both of those are
Hmm.
really, really bad events.
And for I'm I feel like LAN and WAN is both like very common knowledge at the same time. I know I forget what they're called.
Sure.
And when you're talking about LAN, it's a local area network. And for when I think of that, it was a lot of like gaming, like the gaming cafes where you would all
Mm.
have to like work together to play StarCraft or something like that. And but to your point is companies would have to use it to share information as well. Um
Or printers. I remember
oh
that
yeah,
being
and
a
printers.
huge
Yes.
thing. Like, could the printer work, right? And
Oh my
so
gosh.
yeah, so. other
I
resources as well as information.
printers. Oh, yay. Thank you, Josh, for the raid. Josh is going to be on the show tomorrow.
Awesome.
We are actually, I'm just going to give a shout out to Joshua because he just rated us. But y'all, I got my book and we're going to start doing
Nice.
TypeScript shit tomorrow. It's going to
Nice.
be exciting. Okay. So, and Josh, I'll try to get you the, links and stuff, not right before we stream like I did with Dan. I'll work on that today. But thank you. Thank you. And for everybody that just rated in, also join tomorrow. But this is Teach Gen Tech. Today we are talking about authentication from the very beginning. So this one today is going to be much more theory based. And yay, Jay's here too. Jay said, I have a VS Code extension that I'm working on. You should, I don't know if that was, okay. Yes, you guys are figuring that out. Good job. Um, but we were just talking about how we went from somebody hacking into in 61 that they printed the password to be able to use internet or computer time for their PhD, and then how going from LAN and WAN went to getting, having to be in somebody's bubble to get, past their security. And then how did that move to the internet itself?
Sure. So I think what you're talking about is some of the standards that have kind of come out since the internet. Since I mean, the internet was really started in the 60s and 70s. So I want to be careful. Like the web is really the big thing, right? In the 90s, that's what really blew up and made it possible to put all these systems online,
Hmm.
right? Like, Gopher was a thing, FTP was a thing, and there was certainly authentication in those protocols. But the browser is kind of really where everyone starts to worry about all the passwords they have to keep track of, and my passwords getting stolen and other things like that. So, um, in the 90s and 2000s, there were some attempts to kind of bring some of the things that had been built for those LANs and WAN systems, some of the same concepts, like single sign-on, right? Which was what you talked about at the very beginning. People wanted to let that happen inside browser applications. And it used to be, this is less single sign-on, more data sharing, but it used to be like if I wanted to let you, or sorry, if you wrote an application that was, say, a calendar application or a reminder application, and I
Hmm.
wanted to let that application have access to my Google Calendar so that it could automatically pull in my calendar and like send me reminders about stuff I needed to do, like feed the dog or get a gift for my wife or whatever. Um, I would have to I would type in my username and password into your application, and then your application would like sign in as me to Google Calendar. And that is one, you know, possibly has some breakage, right?
Hmm.
Because if I ever change my password, then suddenly the application can't get there. But much more importantly, it's a huge security risk because now if anyone attacks your application and gets access to your database of all the username and passwords for Google Calendar, uh, the attacker has all that valuable information. And so single sign-on with the browser is a way for you to delegate that access without providing the full credentials. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm a bit I told you I end up bouncing all over with the thoughts and ideas and concepts. The thought process that I'm also wanting to think about or going with that popped in my head is so is using SSO more of than that's using an API compared to when you sign on inside of a program because that's just giving them access, therefore it's not an API.
So I'm not sure I understand your question. Can you phrase that, or I don't get it? Sorry.
Yeah, I'll work on rephrasing it. So in your calendar example, when you had to log into the other calendar to get to your Google Calendar, because you physically went to gave them your username and password, that's not an API because it is using their username. You gave them your username and password. So they're entering it in. Where would SSO, like when you use your Google calendar or your Google account to authenticate,
Mhm.
is that an API or is the authentication different?
Yeah. So, taking a little bit of a step back, I remember when I first heard the word API, I had no idea what it actually meant. And the common parlance these days is it's really just a way to have the structured communication between two computers.
Right.
Sometimes it's JSON, sometimes it's something else. Usually it's over HTTP in the web world. But so I would say that it's possible, and maybe I'm being overly programmer-ish and pedantic, but it's possible for both of those to be an API. It really depends on the implementation details, but
Okay.
um, in the larger context, the security thing is really what I would worry about, rather than kind of how the actual access happens. Although the nice thing about standardized SSO is, let me rephrase this. The standardized SSO is definitely going to be using an API. The other one, the kind of the where you're presenting the user and password, that's less standardized and it's kind of hard to tell what's happening there.
Got it. And thank you for that. I know that they're not necessarily anywhere near each other and like the same. It's just like to understand it, being able to ask these questions, I find very, very helpful. So thank you for rolling with that
Yeah,
one.
no worries.
Um, so we've gotten to SSOs now, and we have, like you touched on earlier, multi-factor authentication and how I think that's like also where I'm stuck because I don't know what all is out there or
Sure.
how you implement them. Because
Sure.
I feel like we're more caught up to where we are today, but I don't really know other than the SSO that we were talking about for authentication
Sure.
or username and password kind of thing.
Yeah. So I wrote this thing where I kind of just try to categorize all the different kinds of authentication factors, right? And
All right,
again,
let me share your screen really quick so they
oh,
can see
sure,
that.
sure. Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah. So, and I'm sure we can paste this link in the. I'm not sure how to. Here, I'll paste the link
If
there.
Perfect. I'll put it in there.
And this is just 5,000 words on authentication factors. Whatever. If you need to go to sleep some night, this can be a useful thing. But um, so again, kind of stepping back to where we started before, authentication factor is something you have, something you are, or something you know. And username and password is a very, very common one. And the reason why it's very common is it's easy to implement, it's easy to understand. It is, uh, unfortunately, kind of easy to share, which has pluses and minuses, especially when you talk about the internet world, right? Because something that's easy to share is also easy to steal.
Mhm.
Um, and then the way I probably think about like implementing this is you need to think about kind of what the ramifications are if an account is compromised. And I always say, like, if it's a recipe website, it probably doesn't matter that much. If it's your bank, it matters a lot. And so you can start to think about like the layers of security you want to put on top of your authentication process to make sure, again, that the person says they're Dan is really Dan.
Mhm.
And you need to, as a developer, think about those layers of security, because every layer of security is more work for you and it's more work for your user typically. And so you want
Mhm.
to make sure you match those up. I don't know, is that because do you want to actually talk about like what an actual implementation of a certain factor would be, or?
Yeah, I'm curious.
Sure. Yeah. So let's not talk about username and password. Let's talk about sharing. Let's talk about a one-time code, right?
Okay.
And so there's a couple ways you could implement it, but a very common way is using SMS. Now, a lot of people, if it's a high value account like a bank account or crypto or whatnot, you probably don't want to use them at SMS. And the reason why is there are a couple of attack vectors that are there for it. But for consumer grade application, it's better to have two factors than none,
Mhm.
uh, or two factors than just one. So the way that it works is you have this, you need to, as a developer, build some kind of messaging mechanism. So in this case, you're probably going to use a tool like Twilio or something like that, right? You're not going to build that from scratch. And then you need to build a uh, use a random number generator. And after the login happens with the first factor, you know who the user is. So therefore, you can kind of look up their. Sorry, take a step back. You need to have an account system, and that account needs to capture that delivery mechanism. So a phone number or an email address. And then when the user logs in, before you allow them full access to your system, you say, I'm going to send you a code. You look up their account, you generate a random number, you send the code to them, again, using Twilio, or if it's an email system, you're going to use like a SendGrid or something like that. Then you need to build a form that actually they can enter that code into. And then once that's done, you have that additional assurance of what um, who that person is, right? Because they've previously associated their phone number with their account, and now they've just provided their password and their username, which is what we call the first factor, and they provide an additional factor. And you can do this in a couple ways. You can do it right at login, and then
Mhm.
there's also this concept called step-up authentication. And you may know this, like if you're about to send someone money, sometimes you'll be prompted for a password or a code that's sent.
Mhm.
And that's because the developers have, again, modeled out the risks, and they've determined that, if you just want to go read your bank account balance, that's one level of risk. If you want to send money to somebody else or to somebody new, then that's a different level of risk. And so we're going to authenticate you again because it's a riskier operation.
How do you choose as oh gosh, so many questions coming up at the same time. Um, I'm gonna ask both and then you can go with whatever direction of like next time that you're on the show, I guess this is the best way to can we go through like how we would build something to authenticate? Like what that would look like if somebody's wanting to get into authentication and security? Like that's one question. And
Mhm.
then, oh gosh, like how do we like know where to start as like a big picture? Like if somebody has an idea, how do you know all the different layers that go into it?
Sure, sure. So let me take your first question, which is, honestly, I probably wouldn't want to show someone how to build authentication like from the ground up. And the reason for that is that there are a ton of great products out there. FusionAuth is one, but there are open source libraries as well, like for Python, for Ruby, for Java, for any language that you can think of. There are libraries out there. And yeah, I think it'd be a disservice to your watchers, to your listeners, to like tell them actually go out and build your own, right? Because I've built
Mhm,
my own, and it's so easy to make so many mistakes. So, what might be a more interesting thing to do would be like take an open source library and integrate it with something like FusionAuth, or even just look at the library, right, and say, oh, these are some of the choices they've made. Both
mhm.
those would feel more responsible to me. So, um,
So, okay, then I guess just to ask these questions too,
sure,
because like if we're looking at something like Fusion Auth, like, okay, now I got to think about this.
sure.
Uh, I'm building an app and I want to use like create a username and password database creation. Am I going to build that and then bring in somebody like FusionAuth, or does FusionAuth actually do that uh, username and password layering as well?
It's your choice, right? So yeah, FusionAuth does do username and password as well as kind of other SSOs and other functionality. I think it really depends on what you see the scope of your application being. If you excuse me, if your application is going to be one thing, right? Like you're building like a portfolio app or something like that. Excuse me. I would not start with Fusion Auth. I would start with a library. And, I know Django has an authentication library. If you're building on Django, Rails has Devise, Spring has Spring Security. And because it's a toy application, it's fine to intermingle your username and password data with your other data for your application, right? Your recipes, your to-dos, whatever they are. Where you want to bring in something like Fusion Auth, and again, this is not a Fusion Auth pitch, everyone. There are other options out there, and I'm happy to talk about them if you have questions. Auth0 is one, Keycloak is another. Um, but if you have a centralized authentication server, it's very similar to having a centralized database server, right? Like, there's no reason that you couldn't, for every application, write your own data to and from disk, right? You could absolutely do that. And people did that in the 60s, but then they realized that having a centralized store of data let them control access better. It let them see interrelationships between data better, and it let
Mhm.
someone else build software that was specifically for managing data. Authentication is the same way, right? Like, if you have 2 applications or 3 applications, now suddenly you want single sign-on. Maybe you want to be able to see correlations between how people use different applications. And it's a lot easier to do if you have a centralized identity store than if you have it kind of application A manages their users, application B manages their users, application C manages their users. Does that help?
It does. I feel like it's one of those things that um I might need to noodle on for a bit because of like it totally does make sense, but I'm like, what is the part that doesn't make sense? Sorry. Sorry, y'all. We got a hello in YouTube because we're streaming there too. And I'm like, oh, I should probably go say hi. So what up, Hack? How's it going? And Rivet also .NET has
Yes.
identity, which they've always liked working with. Um, I think but that's kind of currently where I'm stuck
Mm-hmm.
of like, okay, cool. Like all these libraries have something that we can use for authentication, like starting there and then how you build upon it and seeing like different use cases.
Mm,
And again, y'all, this isn't necessarily like Fusion Auth specific. It's just Fusion Auth because Dan knows Fusion Auth.
sure.
Um, we can have other guests on from other companies. Find someone and we'll talk to them too.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that's really where I'm stuck going from theory to practical in a lot of times like I'm like cool theory I can stick with that I got it but this one I'm really struggling with like,
Sure. Well, let me try to phrase it a different way. So if you're starting out and you're just building one application, first thing you do is don't roll your own username and password. Go look for .NET Core Identity, or again some of the other options that I've mentioned, because what that will do is that will provide a battle tested way for you to implement authentication in your application. And yes,
okay
there will be more things to learn, right? Because you're like, oh man, I'm just trying to write this Python application. Why do I have to learn Django authentication? But by doing that, you're going to follow best practices and your users are going to be more secure. Now, then the issue becomes, cool. So I have my data for my application and I have my user data in the same database. Means
okay
it's easy to deploy, it's easy to upgrade, yada yada. But then what happens if you're like, okay, my application actually is taking off and I want to add a forum and I want to add a help desk, and I want to build a second application. You have 2 choices there, right? The first choice is each of those things has its own user data store, right? And people, if they want to sign up for application, the second application, they can do that. If people want, if someone needs a file support ticket, they need to sign up with the support ticket system. That can work, but you quickly get to the point where you have a lot of applications, and um, somebody is going to get peeved. I was going to use a different word, but I'll use the word peeved, at having to sign up, especially if they're paying you money. They're like, why do I have to sign up for the application and also sign up for the support ticket system?
yeah
Or more critically, like, what if you have an employee who's on the support ticket system and is an admin, and they leave, and you remove them from the support ticket system, but you forget to remove them from the application? Well,
mm-hmm.
now you've introduced a security risk. So that is where it makes sense to start to consolidate these. And again, the nice thing is that in 2012, approximately, that we've kind of collapsed authentication across different systems, and managing these silos is at least in terms of authenticating with a single user identity store is a solved problem. You want to use a technology called OIDC, which grew out of OAuth, but OIDC was standardized in 2014, and it's just going to make it easy for all those different systems to talk to one central data store. And then if Dan leaves, you remove Dan from the central data store, you lock his account. Now he can't log into any of those systems that use the identity store. So if your users only can listen, you can only have one takeaway from this. It's don't roll your own, use a library.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing would be, once you get to a certain size, you're going to start to want to look at centralizing your identity store. Does that help? I don't know. I feel like I rambled a little bit there.
It helps. It helps. And also given the example. And then again, I'm great or horrible, no matter which way you look at it, at asking and comparing it to what I've learned so far from other situations of like working at a startup. They may not have like SSO set up like the same as a corporate, like a big corporate um, place. So they're more than likely like a startup that may not allow you logging into everything, probably isn't using something like OIDC. They're still doing it as multiple small logins. Therefore,
Mhm.
it's a lot easier for somebody to keep their content because they didn't put it into the OSS system.
You mean it's a lot easier
Oh,
for someone
SSO
to
system. Sorry, I said that backwards.
keep their access, like
Yeah.
after they leave, or
Yeah.
maybe if they switch departments? Yes. Although I will say, for startups, like a lot of startups I know of, delegate to something like Google Workspaces or Office 365,
Hmm.
and that can help a lot, right? Because I'm I'm pretty sure when you leave a startup, they're going to revoke your Gmail access. That's like kind of top on the
Hmm.
list.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so if you have all these other apps hanging off of it, that can be a good start for a centralized identity store. It's got its limits, and it's really employee focused rather than customer
Hmm.
focused, but it can work. Like, you're not going to give every customer who files a support ticket a Gmail account
Right.
at your,
Right.
your, but certainly for the employee space, that's a good place to start.
And then, um, again, this is for y'all that are watching today. This is a theory based one. So we're not doing any coding, but it's also like the conceptualizing of it. And then we will be working on another project in the future. So please ask questions and go through it. That does bring me to like the startup idea of because startups are startups, they're starting, they're not as well established. How, because I think the scalability of, it's like one or two people that started, then they add another person, then, you have 10 people, 50 people, 100 people, and they may not have some type of SSO or OIDC. Like, how does a company implement that, and is it difficult slash expensive to do so?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on. I mean, I think the first thing you need to do is you need to have that pain or the decision
Okay.
to make that choice, right? And so sometimes that's driven by a large external customer who says, "Hey, our security people are asking us to make sure that you have a certain certification, or you can attest to certain things, right? That, like, when an employee leaves your company, they're not going to continue to have access to our data,
Hmm.
or something like that, or maybe there's an incident of some kind." Um, the other thing to think about is that it does offer some business enablement. It's not all pain, because if
Hmm.
you have a central identity store, and this is maybe more for the customer side of things than the employee side of things, but marketing loves that, sales loves that,
Hmm.
accounting loves that, because there's kind of one place where all your customers live, and
Mm-hmm.
you can go look in and do an audit easily and kind of see who's using what.
Mm-hmm.
When was the last time company A logged into our system?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so that's kind of the motivational part of it, right? There's uh, the the good and the bad, right? The pain or the business enablement. And then I guess how you start, it really depends on where you are. We've definitely had customers who've come to us who have totally custom systems, right? They wrote their own. And so from there, it's really a question of identifying where the users, where's the passwords, what other data do you want to pull over to the centralized identity store? Um, if, on the other hand, you've used a library and there's some kind of internal data store and it's not custom, then what I'd probably look at is seeing if there's a similar, um, basically doing kind of a breaking it apart. And so if before you have your to-dos or your recipes and your user data in one database, I'd probably try to break them apart into two and have the application use OIDC to interact with that data store. And then you can start to hang other applications off of that data store, and basically you're running your own identity server at that time. And the question then becomes, well, do you want to be responsible for that PII? Do you want to be responsible for maintaining that data store that interfaces with everything else using that standard OIDC, or do you want to swap it out for a system, again, Fusion Auth, Auth0, Keycloak, etc., that will still talk to it? But by separating out those steps, I think you make it a little bit easier to swap in rather than trying to change two things at once. Does that make sense?
Some of it. We're going to go with some of it.
Sorry,
um,
please feel free to stop me. So I'm obviously passionate about this. Like if I say something that doesn't make sense, be like, "Hey Dan, like what on earth did you mean by whatever?" Because uh, this is the great part about your show, right? Like
yeah, yeah.
I don't look at the world through new eyes with authentic, at least respect to authentication. You know, kicking through leaves in autumn, yes, but like, um, you
Yeah.
know, so I need your assistance to know when I say something that is a concept that maybe doesn't make sense or I'm talking too fast or whatnot.
I think it's definitely something that is also somewhat hard to do as a newbie because it's like you don't know what you don't know yet. So like what you're saying may make enough sense that that's why I really love doing these and then having people come back on or multiple people from one industry
Sure.
because it's like learning what different pieces of it may connect them together more, but then also may bring up different questions to put two and two together. Um, I would say, and I'm the entire time you're telling me about this, I'm coming up with like real life scenarios that I'm like, I don't know if this goes into it. So I have another scenario to
Yeah.
like run by you
Yeah.
of, so can someone have, and I think I know the answer to this, like something open source and because like a lot of startups will have like their own content and then they have open source. It's where they have to like separate everything because they can't have it all in the same area. Would they only have to separate databases or would they have to separate a ton of like have private repos for like the product and things like that and then public repos for all of the open source stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a common pattern. I see that people, separate those out, but at the
Mhm.
same time, you probably want one data source, and you want to know, like, is this person logging into the public repo or the private repo?
Mhm.
And again, you're not going to want those repos to kind of have their own identity stores. And GitHub is the obvious like choice for source code because they've done a good job of like maintaining that level of
Yeah.
permissioning structure. But um, yeah, does that
That does. That does. And I like it. Homie's like this really helps plus one a bunch to absorb, but makes sense. Yes.
cool?
I'm glad you feel the same way, homie. And using a library within a framework, next off with Next.js, for example. What are your thoughts?
It's great. Yeah, I think actually that came up just the other day because there's actually a Fusion Auth integration for NextAuth out there, but they have integrations for lots of other identity providers. And if you're building on Next.js, please use NextAuth, because one, it's going to save you a bunch of time because you don't have to kind of build your own username and password. You will have to learn the library, and that's always the trade-off when you're in software development, right? Like, you could write your own and know it intimately, but then guess who's responsible for maintaining it? You are. Or you learn the library once and then you can use it on multiple projects. So yes, short answer is NextAuth would be a great choice if you're using Next.js.
Okay, and that goes back to your how you mentioned earlier that like like Python and um like Ruby or Django, they all have their own security libraries
Mm-hmm.
or authentication libraries.
Or more than one, right? Like, I know JavaScript has like Passport, and I know even some of the, like, and this is a good point. What Homie brought up is it's not just like the languages. Sometimes it's the frameworks within the languages, right? Like, I don't know if you could use Django Auth. I doubt you could use Django Auth with the Flask application, for example. So it's not just learning the languages libraries. Like, in fact, as far as I know, there's no language that has like built into the language authentication stuff. Just because it's a high enough level, it's usually built into a framework. But
Okay. I am sending this. I just Googled it. So yes, this is the Google link. Because I think this is also something that I would have gotten really stuck on would be like, what do you look up to get started on these? And knowing that it's like the language authentication library. That is something that I think would be very, very helpful. I looked up JavaScript because a lot of what I do is JavaScript. Um, but this makes a lot of sense on how you would get started. So, and then proceed through all of it. Um, I feel like I don't know what to ask you next because I'm like, there's a lot there.
sure.
Is there something that you think newbies should be asking about or I haven't asked about that is a good place to start or
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so I guess if you're a newbie on a team, I think asking about how they made their authentication choice is an interesting
Mhm.
thing, right? Like, what library do they pick? Um, what issues do they have with it? I think that knowing some of the concepts we've talked about around like what's a factor of authentication, what's multi-factor,
Mhm.
um, what is a library versus like an identity server, identity data store, are things that are useful. I guess the other thing I would say is, um, I you know I think there's always this desire on my part to kind of peel the layers back and like dig into like what actually happens when you do a password,
Mhm.
when you enter a username and password. Like, what are the steps? Just like that old interview question of, walk me through every step of an HTTP request when I request
Mhm.
google.com. I think that can be helpful if you're wanting to nerd out, but the bigger thing I would ask that your users all think about is like, spend the time to read about the library and how to use it rather than worrying about what it's doing on the covers. Because if it's a kind of a known, respected open source library or a product, like my employer, um, we think about all those things under the covers. And so the reason for that is so you don't have to, the same way you don't have to think about what happens when you request Google from the browser. So does that, I don't know whether that's helpful
Yeah,
or
yeah,
not,
yeah, that
but
does. And it makes me think of so we just started I say we, the audience and we just started using Anki, which is like a like flashcards to like learn this type of stuff and like the questions you were asking, I was like, we could put that on flashcards.
yeah.
And
Well,
then oh
go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just gonna, no, no, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, Homie had a question of if they understand correctly that Auth is trying to solve the Auth problem as Auth solution that works in most situations.
Yeah, so Auth0 is one of the companies that are doing this, and I have a lot of respect for them. They started, oh gosh, I want to say 2011, 2012, and have done a great job of, especially for developers, especially for the customer market, really being in the forefront of that. We like to think we're a great competitor to Auth0, and we're less expensive in most cases. But yeah, Auth0 is one of them. I think if you're on AWS a lot, Cognito is another one. Microsoft has their own option. I think a lot of companies are realizing this is a real issue, and by offering this up to developers, again, going back to the very beginning, it's all about taking something that's undifferentiated, that's risky off of developers' plates and letting them focus on the features that people actually really want. And so, again, Auth0 is doing a good job. I think Fusion Auth has its own strengths.
I'm giggling because y'all, I even said Auth because like I get that it's a 0, but still looks like Auth.
Well, so here's the funny thing, and this is like totally tangential to authentication. Like, this is something I would tell all newbies. Like, when you live in a world, like you get enmeshed in it, and the things that seem important in that world seem really important to you. I remember when Auth0 got bought by Okta, it was titanic for our company, right? It was a huge issue, and not issue, that's the wrong word, huge opportunity, huge change.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought it was huge. And then I listened to some podcasts, and there was like a passing mention of it, right? Because it wasn't that big. And I think authentication should be that way for most developers. Like, they shouldn't really have to care that much about it. And the same is true of so many other things. But I think that it was humbling to me to realize, oh, this thing is at the center of my world right now. And yet for most devs, 99% of devs, they don't care. And nor should they.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And good call out, Jay. Some people call it that. Folks may not call me out on it, but I don't know. I
I've
come
heard
up with some funny names. Like I always want to say Vite and not Veet. And I'm like, no, that's not it either. Or I always say CIDC instead of CICD.
CIDC sounds like an awesome rock band or something. I don't
Right?
know.
But I think it is because of ACDC.
Totally.
So I mix them up. Yes, please start calling them that. I mean, it'll be great. They'll be like, shit, Jen's like can't say anything. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Um, oh yay. Homie, it's settled. Fusion Auth, Auth. It's fine, but Dan came to teach us and obviously is really passionate about. Yes, and
Well, thank
oh,
you.
name. Yes.
That's
Yes.
awesome.
I like it. I like it. And yes, actually, y'all, funny enough, just timing on all of this. I did have a conversation with Otho. Yeah, I'm just gonna call them that now. And I was like, yeah, like Fusion Auth is coming on. It's great to always get like different experiences from different companies, different points of view, like even people within the same company, because hearing it multiple times from different people, different learning styles, like it's just the way we learn. And they were like, yeah, no, bro, like if we want to, you got to like prepare questions. So maybe someday we'll do that. If y'all want to do that, like let's do it. Just help me come up with questions. I'm not doing that by myself. I don't know what questions to ask. So instead, we might just have more Dan. Instead of more cowbell, we'll have more Dan. I like it.
Awesome.
And thank you all for coming in today. You're in a store now. Thank you for coming into the store. And oh yeah. Yeah.
Jenn,
Yeah.
thank you so much for having me. It was really fun to talk about this. And I appreciate the questions from your audience. That was really great. And I do look forward to coming back in maybe walking through some code, doing some implementation
I
stuff.
am excited
So,
about that. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. And then, y'all, just as a heads up, you are totally going to get rated over to Learn with Jason, just because I think it's so nice when people raid into other channels, even if, no matter how many people it is, it's always like really nice to do. So I'm rating y'all now, and we'll have Dan on again. Who knows when, but we will keep you posted. Bye, everyone.